So you want to get into Fate, huh? First rule of getting into Fate, don't. Second rule of getting into Fate, if you're going to get into it, don't listen to the community. The community will have you going every which way as to which entry to start with, when the reality is pretty much any entry can be a decent starting point, even if you do miss out on a few things. If you want the quick version of that video, it's that. Just try an entry, and if you like it, you like it. If you don't like it, give it some time and maybe try again some other time. Give it a couple takes. That said, if you want a little bit more structure, a little bit more of a solid recommendation, or if you want some warnings on what may or may not work so well if you try to get into them, that's kind of what I'm here to offer you today. I don't know if you noticed, but there's a few Fate figures around here. None of them were bought by me. Not one of them. So, buyer beware. So, I'm just going to go down the list of a few of the Fate entries that I think are notable. The ones that people tend to see at first glance. And I'll cover a few just general Type Moon entries as well, as that's all. Type Moon in general can be a decent place to hop into the universe or hop into Fate just parallel to. The first one I've got here is probably the one the community will most commonly request, maybe demand in some cases you start with. The Fate Stay Night visual novel. Look, I'm not going to lie, this is probably the best place to get started. In theory, it's a really, really great visual novel. It started as an eroge, but there are actually non-pornographic versions that have been made since the original came out, called Rialta Nua. That's the one that you'll probably want to start with, because the porn isn't very good anyways. But they're really great for world building and for characterization. It's just, the one problem here is that it is by far the least accessible way to get into Fate. While there are translations online, if you're not willing to go through the effort of downloading translation patches and installing them while also finding a safe to download ROM of the game, then that could be an issue. And I'm going to be honest here, I know a lot of people are not into visual novels. I myself haven't read it in full yet. I've only skimmed a little bit of it. Just for time, mostly, because visual novels are a time sink. Even more so than some JRPGs I've seen. And they can feel like a bit of a marathon to read just because of how long... Because it's like reading a novel, except the novel paces. Novels you can tend to get through quicker depending on your reading speed. Visual novels, not so much. Usually it's got all that art associated with it that you probably want to appreciate a little more. So, while the visual novel is definitely the best place to start, if you're not a visual novel person, it's not necessarily the place you want to start. Like, I wouldn't recommend, let's say, Sea Dog VA get started with Fate here, because that's a bad idea. So, next up is the next place that people might tell you to watch, which will be just the Fate Stay Night adaptations, starting with the original Fate Stay Night Studio Dean adaptation.
Boo!
Starting with the original Fate Stay Night Studio Dean adaptation, shut up, Seki. Moving on to the Ufotable Unlimited Blade Works adaptation, completely ignoring the Studio Dean adaptation of that one. And then, lastly, to the Heaven's Feel movie adaptations by Studio Ufotable. This is, if you're an anime only, the closest you're going to get to getting the visual novel experience. That said, Fate Stay Night, the Studio Dean adaptation, can feel very dated and unpolished at times, especially because story beat-wise, they took from multiple different routes, and that leads to things like Shiro's character feeling off without certain explanations as to what he's actually doing. And in general, it's not going to be as accessible for first-time viewers, especially not in 2022. The other thing people sometimes recommend is starting with Unlimited Blade Works, and that one's it's not bad. I've seen people start with that, but the problem with that one is Unlimited Blade Works, especially if you've watched Fate Zero, can feel a little bit awkward. Just because it's... How do I put this? It's kind of built to subvert your expectations from what you see in Fate Stay Night. Certain things happen, and certain characters have outcomes that are completely contrary to what happens in Stay Night. And even starting with Heaven's Feel is not a good idea in anime form at the very, very least, because Heaven's Feel, the movies, do not have an introduction. For anime-only audiences, that is the number one complaint, is they have no idea what's going on when watching Heaven's Feel. I think later on the movies get better, and although sometimes you might have some issues here if you're a visual novel reader, but it's a bit rough to recommend getting into the anime in the Stay Night order. But if you're willing to put in the try, and you can get past some of the more dated aspects of Studio Dean's Fate Stay Night adaptation, it is worth looking into. But know what you're getting into before you start. Next up is one that is hotly debated in the community, starting with Fate Zero, either the anime or the light novel. The issue with Fate Zero, and the reason why the community might advise against it, is just because it's tonally different than the rest of the Fate franchise. It's a little bit darker, and it's got... One big issue is that it spoils pretty much all of the twists of Fate Stay Night. That's how I personally got into Fate, full disclosure. That said, I think a large portion of the anime community gave Fate even the time of day because of this adaptation. For a lot of people, this was the first entry of Fate they ever saw. This is the Sea Dog VA route. I do think if you are a fan of specifically Gen Urobuchi, who did Madoka Magica, and what's another one? Psychopaths. If you're a fan of those works, you might actually find this is the easiest work to get into, because this, as a standalone Gen Urobuchi work, can be a good accessible point to get into Fate in. And then you would jump into Fate Stay Night, where having a little bit of background can fill in some of the blanks that the anime might leave out. But full disclosure, there is some pushback in the community to starting that way for the reasons I've said before. I probably wouldn't have included this one myself, but I know I'd be punched if I didn't talk about this one at the very least. I see the knuckle cracks off screen. The Case Files of Lord Elmoy II, and as well as the Don't You Do It, Seki. The Adventures of Lord Elmoy, its sequel series. Woo! Okay, so, for sake of not getting punched, let me go ahead and speak as nicely about starting here as I can. This is a good springboard into pretty much the rest of the universe. It touches on concepts that you do not get with the original Fate Stay Night or Fate Zero. It helps introduce you to the more Harry Potter parts of the franchise, the urban fantasy elements of Type Moon and Nasuverse. And I'd be probably bitten if I didn't mention that Lord Elmaloy here is peak Professor Daddy material. That said, peak Professor Daddy doesn't really have a character arc in the series. In fact, his character arc is completed in a completely different series, making, as far as his character development goes, this series is just an epilogue. That's all it is for his character arc. There are other character arcs. There are other characters it'll introduce you to, and it is fascinating to watch, but if you're a character person or you want to see character development out of your main character, can't recommend starting with this one. Alright, time for the moneymaker. The one that you're going to see the most on social media and on YouTube and everywhere you go. Fate Grand Order, the gacha game, the mobile game, and the arcade game if you're in Japan. Okay, let's get this out of the way. This is a horrible entry to start with. If we're talking the anime adaptations, it just jumps from the very beginning of the story to the very end of the story. And that's for a very good reason, and that's because a large chunk of the middle just isn't very interesting. And it's bad enough to where, in order to get the club members, Realm, Seki, and Vorn, to actually experience the stuff at the end, I'm running them through an entire D&D campaign adaptation of the damn story. So, it's a little rough to recommend. That said, I can recommend it to only 2 people. If you like Fate, at which point this is a good fan service series, but again, this is about starting Fate, so you have to push that out of the way. Or, the other potential reason you might start this one is because even if this isn't Fate fan service, this can also work as a bit of a history buff fan service. So if you're a history major or an anthropology major, you might get a little bit more out of this than your average Joe looking to get into the series. Because, let's be honest here, there's a few character interactions that, although they work on a Fate level, that Fate level only works because that was something established in mythology, or the parallels between two characters exists already in mythology and history and general storytelling. Alright, I'm going to mention this one not because I think it's particularly the best place to get involved with Fate, but because it's one that's going to probably come up a bit more in the near future. Fate Extra. This is a JRPG. I've seen it described as a bit of a Persona clone. I don't know exactly how much I'd agree with that, but that is there. It's got one of the more interesting stories in Fate. If you read it, it's going to get you used to the weirder Fate stuff. In fact, it's going to get you used to it in a way that I would describe as being thrown into the deep end of a swimming pool to see if you're going to be able to swim. If you can't stand the bullshit to begin with, you're probably going to be right off the Fate train already. But if you can, you might actually really enjoy this one. That said, there's two problems with this. One, the combat system in the original game is a bit ass. And the second problem is this game is long out of print. It's available on emulators, I guess. And I believe you can download the original game on the PS Vita still. But who owns a PS Vita these days? I guess a few people. Realm owns a PS Vita. But other than that, it might be a little bit more difficult to play for many modern gamers. There is a remake coming out, though, and that's what I meant by it's going to be in the discussion more for starting for Fate. If the remake doesn't fuck up the combat system, then this might actually be a pretty decent place to start if you're a JRPG fan. Fate Extra, by the way, takes Fate in a bit more of a sci-fi direction than any of the other Fate entries do, so if that appeals to you, you can give it a shot. Alright, this is a bit of a weirder one for me to recommend, because I don't particularly like this one. But it's also not... I don't particularly hate this one either. Fate Apocrypha. It's going to be the last of the Fate entries that I'm going to bring up here, I think. If I missed one, you want to go over the merits and demerits of starting there in the comments section, feel free. But Fate Apocrypha is... It's a fairly standalone Fate story, actually. It's going to introduce you to everything you need to know about the Grail War, and it introduces a shit ton of heroic spirits, so you're going to get a wide variety. And it probably matches the tone of Fate more than Fate Zero, which is the other more straightforward Fate adaptation. You would probably have zero issue jumping in here and understanding what's going on. The problem, in my opinion, is not one that everyone's going to find, but the anime isn't... It's not bad. It's just not spectacular. It's not going to do very many things interesting or new. Even as an anime fan, I'd say that. So really, it's going to carry you depending on how much you like the servant concept. So you'll have to, if you want to try this one, just be aware there's more to Fate than this. But this is a pretty good entry to start with if you're worried about how confusing the Fate timelines look and how complicated things are to understand between each other. You don't really need to understand anything to jump into this one. Alright, I'm going to try going through these a little bit quicker because there's really only two entries, just one with multiple parts. For non-Fate stuff, for Type Moon and Nasuverse stuff, the first one that people are going to think of is Tsukuhime, which is sort of Fate's sister series, where Fate's about historical figures. Tsukuhime is about vampires. Why might you want to start with Tsukuhime? Well, it technically predates Fate. So, a lot of stuff that Fate does, Tsukuhime did first, and it might feel a little bit less derivative of itself as you go through with it, I think. And even more so than in Fate, I think Tsukihime is a little bit easier to find because you can find it on Abandonware. That said, if I had to present any issues with this, it's just like Fate, it's still a non-translated visual novel from Japan. While you can get translations, it's still a few more steps I know a lot of people are willing to go through, and it's still a visual novel. But beyond that, I think between Fate and Tsukihime does have some scenes that admittedly feel a little bit culturally baited as far as the anime community goes. I'm talking the anime community that was a little bit more messed up when things like Goblin Slayer came up. Or Berserk is... It has some early writers' mistakes as far as that kind of topics go, and you know what I'm talking about if you know what I'm saying with Berserk and Goblin Slayer. It's not that bad in my opinion, but it might seem a bit distasteful. That said, there is a remake that does modernize things a bit. It cleans up the art, and I have to imagine some of the more distasteful elements were removed from that story. It might sit better with a lot of people, and in Japan, it's available on the Switch and the PS5. The huge problem, though, is we don't really have any high-quality full translation patches for it yet. So even if you're willing to translate it, it's a little bit harder to get into. And on top of that, it's not ported to PC. Meaning, beyond just finding a translation patch, which may not be to the quality of the other entries that were Japanese only, you also have to find you also have to find emulators for the Switch or PS5 to make this work. And it's available. You can find easier emulators on the Switch, but I don't advocate for that kind of thing, not openly. And another issue with starting with this one is Tsukihime has 5 routes. This one only adapts 2. So it's not going to give you the full story. What about the Tsukihime anime, you might ask? Well, the big issue with that one is one does not exist, so we're moving on. If you really, really want to read Tsukihime, or experience Tsukihime, right now as an English audience member, the way I can recommend it most is the manga. It's probably the most accessible way to read Tsukihime. It's a great retelling of the first route of the game. It's only giving you 1 out of 5 routes. It does capture the characters far better than I think any anime that may or may not have released before 2020 does, but that doesn't exist. We can ignore it. And although it's only fan translations, it's a manga fan translations. I think a lot of the anime community is pretty experienced finding magical remedies for manga that weren't translated. That said, I will warn you, there's still one scene in there that you might find distasteful, but come on, we're the anime community. We can brush over that, right? Right? Please? Alright. Garden of Sinners. This is sort of the last... Actually, I got one more after this, but Garden of Sinners is the last one I can recommend at the moment. Garden of Sinners is a bit of a rough one. At the time when it came out, it was a beautiful animation demo, and a lot of the anime community fell in love with it because that was probably the best animation, period, at the time. That said, that's not the case today. It didn't age badly. The animation didn't. But it's not going to blow you away as the future of anime anymore because it is the present of anime. The issue right now with starting with Garden of Sinners is, without being that animation demo, the first movie, and I haven't read it yet, but I've heard the first light novel, can be a little rough to get through, to say the least. I think everyone I have seen watch it has described it as a fever dream. But if you can push past that, it is probably, out of all the Type Moon works, I've experienced, this is probably the most grounded work to start with. It's not throwing you into vampires and summoning historical figures to have Pokemon battles for you for a cup. It is solving weird supernatural problems in the city. And I think as a Western audience who enjoys stupid shit like Supernatural and these crazy urban fantasy horror stories, there's probably more of an audience for these kind of stories going blindly, I think. So this is a decent place to get started. Just be aware that first movie might be a little rough, and you might have to give it a little bit of a growing room. Alright, the last one I'm going to mention here is the MiHoYo visual novel, and we'll touch on the second part in a second. It is, once again, another Japanese-only visual novel with an incomplete translation patch, unless there's some mythical translation patch out there, but I don't know where you get a hold of that. Technically, this is the first major Nasu work to be written. It was written and remade, so this is the foundation for a lot of what Fate, Tsukuhime, Garden of Sinners, all of the Type Moon franchises build themselves off of. So it is, by far, the best starting point if you speak Japanese and can get a hold of the game. If you're in Japan and you speak Japanese, there's a Switch port coming out and a PS5 port. So play those, but otherwise there's really no accessible way to experience this one unless you are on that mythical part of the internet with a completed translation patch. That said, Ufotable is doing a movie, or a series of movies, we don't really know at this point yet. But I can't speak to how accessible that'll be due to, it not being out yet. This movie could be shit. Or these movies could be shit. So, you'll have to tell me, commenters from the future, the far future, whether or not this one's any good and a good place to start. I'd appreciate your input. So, yeah, that's my general rundown of the Fate series and how a lot of the major entries in both Fate and Type Moon are for getting into this overall series. If you have any other suggestions in the comments, feel free to bring them up to me, because I know I missed stuff here. Fate and Type Moon are fucking huge. So yeah, if you like this though, and you're a big Fate fan and you made your way here, go watch our Seki Reacts to Fate series. It's a good little series where you can find Seki, who is a history buff and an anthropology major, reacting to my descriptions of the Fate characters. Sometimes in admiration and sometimes in horror. Or alternatively, we've done a bunch of Fate reviews on the channel. Give those a check out. But otherwise, yeah, for more of this, just like our video so I know to make more. Comment and subscribe. We do a little bit too much Fate on this channel sometimes.